What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
Braking system brakes on the Bavarians are traditionally good. Even the weakest versions have 324 by 30 mm front brake discs, neither thickness nor diameter. The versions more powerful, for example, 745i, have already 348 mm, and the top ones are supposed to have discs with diameter as much as 374 mm and thickness of 36 mm. On the rear axle discs are also ventilated, and the sizes start from the same 324 mm. What is characteristic? The original discs rarely warps, and their wear resistance is at the level. They serve more than 100,000 kilometers at normal operation with original pads. Even with very active driving, you cannot worry. The pads will not catch fire, and the discs will not lead when overheating. The front calipers are beautiful in their simplicity. The design with one cylinder and floating bracket works with discs with diameter up to 348 mm, and two piston calipers work with larger ones. There are normal piston seals and successful mechanics. The mechanisms last at least 10 years even in our conditions and are easy to rebuild. All spare parts are available and accessible literally everywhere. The rear brakes are also reliable. The handbrake actuator is electric. There is a small block under the trunk floor that pulls the cables. It is a pity that the drive gear has a plastic crown, which eventually falls apart, and the block stands up. But the Chinese have already established the production of all metal gears, and you can buy a 3D printed crown on local marketplaces. The handbrake itself is implemented by drum pads inside the main disc mechanism, so drifters who like to jerk the handbrake on staging, and not the target audience of this BMW. The pads do not have a very long life, and they are tightened with a ratchet through a hole. This solution is about to turn 40 years old, but in our services they do not remember about it and try to tighten the cables without adjusting the position of the pads. The main concern of the E65 owner in the brake system is the condition of the brake pipes, which are banally corroded, and the ingress of oil into the vacuum lines. The thing is that the standard vacuum pumps on the pre-styling drive oil into the intake. Because of this, there was even a recall campaign, which most car owners ignored in their time. In this case, not only all the pipes are changed, but also the vacuum booster, because the oil kills its diaphragm. Check the force on the brake pedal. If it jumps, it is almost certainly necessary to replace half of the brake vacuum system. Suspension. For some reason, it is considered that the suspension of E65 is very unreliable. They say that it is enough to go from service to service. In practice, the original elements of both front and rear suspensions quite normally withstand more than 150,000 kilometers of urban operation, and even more than 200. The nuance is that everything is made somewhat pretentious, with a very high load on ball bearings and silent blocks. And banal McPherson in front suspension here has as many as 2 levers with non-replaceable ball bearings, and the ball of the transverse lever is finger up, which increases the requirements to the work of seals. As a result, a normal resource can be achieved only if you use original spare parts or a couple of top brands, and another 24. Manufacturers who produce suspension elements turn out to be poor helpers. Individual silent blocks and rods can be not bad and in the budget version, but cheap front arms with ball joints will definitely not have any meaningful resource. Front levers from Lemfeder or TRW are almost certainly enough for 60 to 80,000 kilometers of mileage, but most of the Chinese will ask for replacement after 10,000 miles. However, if you put additional grease under the dust cover and put good clamps on it, there is a chance that some Chinese parts will provide a comparable resource with the best samples. But is such economy justified if you service your car in a service center and pay not only for parts, but also for their replacement? The rear multi-lever arm is quite typical for the brand. The main replaceable elements are 2 upper arms and a ball bearing, or floating silent block, in the attachment of the lower arm to the suspension fist. And the upper levers, even in the strongly non-original, serve their 30 to 40,000 kilometers, which is good, because the original and good brands are often unavailable. However, the resource strongly depends on the average load and acceleration, and on the quality of roads. The main thing here is not to kill the lower support arm. It is expensive, and it is bought mostly second-hand. But if the integral arm jams with a large ball bearing play, the lower arm may be damaged. Well and corrosion in places of contact with bolts does not spare aluminum. The hubs are quite resourceful, but the level sensors and their levers are not very good. In our conditions, they sour and break. You don't have to be afraid of pneumatics in the suspension. Hoses are inexpensive, and the pump head is available in Chinese version. It can be replaced every 50,000. It does not last longer, but it costs a penny. EDC shock absorbers are expensive, and wiring brings its share of worries in their operation, but in general there is nothing wrong with their reliability. They last almost as long as conventional ones. They have a stiffness reserve for most situations, and in soft mode, valve wear and stem loading are lower than conventional ones. But dynamic drive, DD, is a much more troublesome system, which, when worn out, severely impairs handling and even makes driving impossible. On cars with this option, simple torsion stabilizers are made very rigid, but consist of two parts connected by a hydraulic motor. This makes it possible to almost completely eliminate the car's roll in corners. The system is hydraulic, driven by a separate section of the power booster pump. There are several problems with this system. The most frequent and sometimes fatal is the leakage of tubes. Because of them, the pump dies. Another problem is wear of the pump itself, which is expected. The vane pump section of the steering rack often fails, but the high-pressure section of the DD system dies mostly when the system runs out of oil due to DD or rack leaks. The hydraulic stabilizer motors themselves are reliable, but the outer oil seal suffers due to corrosion of the shaft underneath. The design is conditionally non-disassembled, because the stabilizer is usually replaced as an assembly. And note that it makes no sense to replace it with a used one of unknown origin. There may be the same corrosion, and it may leak after installation. A new stabilizer is expensive, and there is no non-original. The original is unavailable for more than a year, and the last price for it was about 450,000 rubles. Used parts of known origin, from southern countries, where this good is in abundance, and the price is small, from 20,000 rubles. For a live stabilizer without traces of corrosion. Steering normal rack with servotronic on E65 is not so bad. In any case, such torments, as on the E60 with the active, there's no such thing. Sometimes the rack leaks, but not very often. It knocks more often, but in most cases everything is solved by tightening. Sometimes the servotronic valve fails, but again it is usually successfully repaired. Transmission. Common problems in the absence of all-wheel drive. There are few common problems with the transmission. Traditionally, it is worth remembering that the elastic clutch of the gimbal needs an eye and an eye. Otherwise, everything is stable enough, though resource of a cardan could be higher. Automatic boxes. The choice of gearboxes on this generation of the 7 is not large, or rather, it is actually absent, because the model was equipped only with ZF6 HP automatic in different versions. The first generation of 6HP19, 6HP26, and 6HP32, which were installed on E65, is not famous for super reliability, although by the end of production most of the problems were solved by reducing temperatures, improving the materials of rubber seals and changing the software. According to the aggregate stuffing, E65 coincides with 5E60, so all key features we have already analyzed in the article about the younger model. The material about the younger model, moreover, 5 illustrates these automatic transmissions much more clearly. The cars are more numerous, their mileage is higher, and the problems are presented more contrastingly. Breakdowns of automatic transmissions of this series were also considered in detail in the review Jaguar XF, the first generation Jaguar. XF was also fitted, as were Audi and other cars of those years. There is nothing much to add to the dramatic stories about unsuccessful technique of these gearboxes. But on E65 there is a separate specificity. Due to low mileage, you may come across a car where no one got into the box, and all the problems are still with it. On the other hand, very few people seriously and constantly drive a 7 Series sedan, and the cars are often very well maintained, so the chances of finding a live automatic transmission are quite high, despite the hot temper of the motors. Motors. Common problems with BMW cars of this period are mostly high temperatures and overcomplication of the design, which became an end in itself, or a well-marketed idea. And aging plastics and rubber are a predictable side effect of that idea. In the case of the E65, except that the diesel cars and the M54 gasoline cars don't show pronounced signs of temperature problems. Gasoline motors. All gasoline motors are familiar to you from other models of the company. In the review year 60, there are both M54 and N52, and the features of the design are analysed in detail. But the most popular engine for 7E65 is N62, N62B36A or N62B40A or N62B44A. And this line of motors, though it was considered in the review of the X5 in E70, but even there it was on the second roll. I hasten to correct this shortcoming. The N62 family of motors is a deep modernization of the M62 series, which traces its lineage back to the M60. The block and cylinder head are almost unchanged, but there are still very significant innovations in the design. For example, the timing mechanism has been radically changed. Its drive now has two separate chains, one for each cylinder head, with their own calipers and tensioners, as well as completely new phase regulators or, as they like to be called by fans of the brand, Varnos. By the way, they are less noisy, but the system errors have not disappeared, and although they occur less frequently, they are more expensive to solve. The main change in the timing system is the introduction of valvetronic, where instead of throttle control by changing the lift height of the intake valves is used. The system as a whole is simple. The valve train rockers have an intermediate support in the form of a shaft with eccentrics, which is rotated by a separate electric motor. The N62 has a different motor on each cylinder head. Due to this, the valve lift height changes from minimum, by a fraction of a millimeter, to full, which allows to slightly reduce pumping losses at partial throttling and almost completely remove them at full valve closing. The car almost does not slow down the engine. This, in turn, allows to slightly reduce fuel consumption, but only in theory. In practice you can't see any difference. The throttle remains. It is needed in case of failure of the valvetronic system. And failures happen often, because instead of a simple electric throttle, in which only the damper axle, two sensors, and drive gears wear out, there is a lot of high-precision mechanics working under a solid load, and backlashes are possible in a whole bunch of nodes. Bend your fingers. The pair of motor shaft worm and eccentric shaft sector gear is the first source of backlash. The motor itself also wears out, and backlash in its bearings is very much a factor, as is axial movement of the shaft. So this is the main source of problems and a candidate for replacement in case of malfunctions. The eccentric shaft itself is held by conventional plain bearings and one roller bearing, and the shaft is spring-loaded, in theory. This should eliminate backlash, but in practice it can create complex oscillations when the bearing points wear out. Bearings are reliable, but otherwise the design is full of nuances. Then the gap can grow after oil starvation, then the roller bearings will fall apart because of the breakage of the cage, then the spring will weaken, then the spring cam will weaken after an unsuccessful assembly, then the tightening of the bolt fixing the shaft position sensor will deteriorate. Rockers also wear out. It is essentially a consumable with a service life of about 150,000 kilometers, so they are rarely changed preventively. In addition, there are hydrocompensators, and on a hot engine they are regularly clogged with sludge if you do not change the oil in time. And there are 32 of them, and when one of them fails, the clearance of one of the cylinders is broken at once. In addition, the motors are still very overheated. Standard temperatures are well over 100 degrees. The opening temperature of the standard thermostat is 105 degrees, and full opening is only at 115 degrees, so scuffing and a lot of problems with plastic, cooling system, and detonation also occur for a reason. Not for nothing forced versions of 4.8 hold up better than the usual motors 3.6 and 4.4, because they have a lower operating temperature, while the preheater in the thermostat works. Remember, though, in the review of the Peugeot 308 I wrote about how to get around a problem like this on a dime. Here they do the same thing. At the same time you can put a thermostat from the M67 diesel with an opening temperature of 91 degrees or a modified thermostat from the M60 for 87 degrees. The block here is a loose lavage, so that scoring of cylinders is not rare. True, and the wear of piston group in unscuffed motors is almost no. You should care more about wear of crankshaft liners than about natural age wear of pistons and rings. But there are enough whole blocks on sale, and Gilzovka is put on a stream. Scuffing is a big trouble mainly because it is treated not only by invested money, but also by time. In most cases it is difficult to find a live used motor not under order. Motors of N73B60 series are also elusile, but their main problem is that in addition to valvetronic for all 48 hydrocompensators, they also introduced direct injection. And injectors turned out to be capricious. They had more than a dozen revisions and several recall campaigns. Moreover, piezo injectors of the first releases have an unpleasant habit to flood the cylinder after power failure, which easily leads to hydrostroke and oil dilution with gasoline, to crankshaft scoring. In addition, intake valves coking very badly, and phaser regulators and chains serve offensively little. As a result, the engine turned out to be frankly unsuccessful. The only thing that can save the owner little is that on the secondary market there are quite a lot of still alive motors for relatively modest money relative to the price of overhaul. In rich southern countries, cars with this engine are easily sent to the dismantling for any reason. If you try to repair such an engine, then even without liners, the repair budget is easily over 800,000 rubles. And it is literally restoration of timing, injection, and wiring and replacement of gaskets. Well, what you wanted. The motor is almost like on Rolls-Royce Phantom 7. Diesel engines. You have already read all flattering words about diesel engines of M57 D30 series, if you have followed the links to the articles about 5E60 and X5. In the recent history of BMW, this is a very long-lasting lineup with good reliability indicators. According to most people, you only need to take care of the liners and fuel equipment. It is a pity that everything is not so simple. Diesel engines before restyling have vortex flaps that can cause a lot of trouble, and in the restyled line of TU2 series motors the aluminum block is weak and cracks, about what I have already written in the review E70, and the damper pulley is not such an insignificant part as first-time buyers think. You can't drive with a torn pulley, and because of the non-original one you can get an increased level of torsional vibrations, and this is not only unnecessary noise, but also a decrease in the life of crankshaft liners, all attachments, and transmission. Most versions of the engine have a steel exhaust manifold, which burns out on the highway, damaging the turbine. The M67 series diesel V8 is found only on the 7th series and is therefore extremely rare. For all its durability, it has a lot of problems with the layout of units, reliability of individual elements, and labor-intensive maintenance. At least access to turbines is difficult, and they need to be checked often. The timing is also not ideal. It has 2 independent chains and is not too resourceful, but it is expensive. Capricious ECG and oil system cause a lot of trouble, as well as the control system with 2 flow meters. People who have owned both M57 and M67 say that the second one sounds and drives much more pleasantly, but costs much more in maintenance, even without serious breakdowns. That's probably close to the truth. One more factor to consider. This motor literally destroys automatic transmission at active style of movement. Even the top ZF6 HP32 does not cope with 750 Nm of torque. F-Class cars at the age of 20 cannot be called particularly prestigious. The price on the secondary market does not just hint at it, but states it directly. But there is a lot of comfort and safety in them. True, and pay a lot for ownership, especially if the car in a rich configuration, and therefore with an expensive motor. But, strange as it may seem, there are variants in the E65 range, which are not likely to ruin the owner. These are cars with M54 M57 engines. They are more expensive than much more mass copies with gasoline V8, not so dynamic and often worse equipped, but most of the comfort is with them. It remains to be determined whether you are ready to put up with the appearance of these cars of troubled times, and whether you want to study forums and technical documentation, so as not to be listed as an honorary sponsor of all neighborhood car services. In conclusion, the BMW 7 Series 4, specifically the E65 and E66 models, presents a fascinating blend of luxury and engineering challenges. While the stabilizer system proves to be more costly than its pneumatic counterpart, it's essential to weigh this against the overall performance and reliability of the vehicle. Additionally, the transmission systems, often regarded as inferior to the robust engines, can impact the driving experience significantly. For potential buyers or enthusiasts, understanding these nuances is crucial for making informed decisions about maintenance and ownership. Ultimately, the E65 and E66 remain iconic representations of BMW's commitment to luxury, but they come with their own set of complexities that should not be overlooked.